All right, finally time for lecture 6. I'm excited. I I realized this morning that it was Gregory's would have been his 96th birthday. I'm giving myself away because I haven't introduced the topic yet, but I'm really excited. So the last time I motivated myself by recognizing that it was Krishna's birthday. So lecture 5, I thought, well, it's a lot has a lot to do with Krishna. So why don't I go ahead and get it done, even though I don't feel fully prepared? And that's what I'm doing again. I'm not in school. It's been so long since I was in school, and I recall that I sometimes did my best work under a little bit of pressure. And if I don't have that deadline and that little excuse or reason to stress, I will I can infinitely procrastinate practically. And so, hallelujah for I'm glad I set this pattern. March 1 last year was Lucian Carr's 100th birthday. March 12th was Jack's would have been his 103rd birthday, and I did part two, or rather, I did lecture 2 then, and then last summer I did lecture 5, having to do with East and West, Jesus, and all of that stuff related to Ginsburg's contribution in that realm. So, okay, lecture 6 is going to be like the ending of a season if this was a TV show. So this is the grand finale. We'll see how grand it is. It's the end. Let's put it that way of this part. So what I have endeavored to do is to kind of unlock the new vision and understand the beat's contribution in a way that takes us well beyond uh, the normal um, adoration, imitation, canonization, deification, all of these things, the museumification of the past that we constantly, it's just you get the academic stuff mixed in there, and it just sort of becomes this dusty library thing. And I wanted to find some keys, or maybe I stumbled upon some keys before I knew I wanted to, that really did unlock it for me. So I've been trying my best to share accordingly what I've learned. And ultimately, and the key is, and the recurring theme, there's a few of them, but I would say that to bring an authentic beat experience to our own lives by understanding kind of what made them tick. And I think the key to all of that is the new vision. And one of these themes is to become the art, to embody all that we can, and to be that presence on the planet, above and beyond the things that we produce, to be literally that present from head to toe and beyond, that people notice, not for the sake of being noticed, but for the sake of having an impact, for the sake of human potential. Let's see. And so I've showcased the muses of the beats, namely Neil Cassidy, Lucian Carr, as people who took a quantum leap in the direction that I'm describing. And now I'm going to introduce Gregory Corso in that same light. So what I'm calling this is uh, Gregory Corso and the classical worldview, but I'm going to add something on the fly right now. Gregory Corso, non-duality, and the classical worldview, because I think they're all mixed in together. So this isn't just introducing Gregory as this figure among the beats, although that is partly what I'm doing. It is illuminating another key, which is that classical orientation and understanding, which is, I'm going to say, part and parcel with the new vision itself. So, but indeed, he was a monumental figure among the beats, and that can't be overstated. So, let's see. So, if the beats, and I maintain that the beats were, in fact, a cosmic intervention on planet Earth, not just post-war America and the whatever that was, better living through chemistry, the suburbs, the rise of the suburbs, the grocery stores, and all of this kind of stuff. That was very self-congratulatory, and was a failure on many levels, and continues to be a failure on many levels, environmentally, culturally, et cetera, et cetera. Fortunately, we live on a complex planet where there are various other more interesting, less destructive things going on at any given moment. and the culture and the arts are always a part of that. So yes, but I would also say though in this context that Gregory himself was a cosmic intervention among the beats. So zooming in even more on that scenario, there were things that the beats needed to understand about themselves and their role in the world. And there are things that the world needed to understand about the beats that only Gregory could have actually embodied and even taught. And that was one of the things that he had, that dual purpose. Lucian and Neil, although they embodied so much as luminous beings, as Carlos Castaneda would put it, that energy was taken away from things that they may have done in the artistic realm. They were the art, so they were good on that level. But what made Gregory extra extraordinary is that he was the poet, the scholar, and the presence all at the same time, which is why he was so key. So one of the roles and one of the reasons that the beats needed to understand themselves is that they were um, catalysts for the destruction of division. There are many that's a big theme in what I'm about to share. That they knocked down those barriers and they integrated and they synthesized things that had up until that point been separated. Going back to lecture one, though, I want to focus on some of these initial keys that got me so excited that influenced me to want to share. First one is that a key to the new vision is that it is a cult. When Lucian was carrying the book A Vision under his arm when he was arraigned in court for the death of David Cameron, he had William Butler Yeats' book A Vision, which was an occult document. Also, the second thing that I was pointing out as a key to the new vision, specifically also occult, but more specific than that, is the work of Carlos Castaneda and what he had to say about personal history and how preoccupation with personal history siphons the energy that we bring um, into the present moment. But if we deal with that, if we create more of a, if we're able to revisit those, there's a process that he calls recapitulation. I haven't really talked much about it, um, but it's a review of one's past, where you withdraw the energy that you left in the past and you put and you it's actually a breathing process. It's like a cross between sort of journaling and a breath process where you're visualizing the past. You inhale to take your energy back that you left there, and you exhale to drop your energy that you don't need. So what that does is it brings a tremendous amount of energy into the present moment. um, and the third thing that I'm going to elaborate on is this idea of the classical worldview, which Gregory was uniquely equipped and able to not only embody but to actually expound on and put the beats into some kind of context in that awareness. And Gregory had something quite beyond what you might. I mean, he had an academic understanding of the classics. He was very well read, as were the rest of the beats. But he lived in that world, and he saw himself as a player in that universe, and he saw the people around him as players in that universe. Jack was known for uh, not suggesting, but demonstrating through his writing that anyone could be divine. You never really knew who you were dealing with. It could be a bum in an alley, and you could approach that person and understand in them something of the divine. And he was so tender in his expression of that um, in many cases. Gregory just took that much further to a quantum place. Um, Now, the beats were all read. Were all read. The beats were all well read, and certainly were well versed in the classics, as well as a lot of other literature. But because of what I've just described, Gregory had something extra to bring to that game that made him very different from the others. One of the things that his classical understanding allowed him to do, going back to what I just shared about Jack, is he could ask different questions. In the classics, and especially in that mythological, pantheonic, um, mystical, there's so many different ways to describe it. But in that universe, the gods are reaching down and we're reaching up. The gods were often rascals and they were involved in a lot of the same drama that we humans are involved in, but just with that extra spark of divinity, this kind of superhero um, awareness or embodiment that really, really takes things to the next level. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the keys that I've already shared, particularly in lecture one, um, starting with the occult. So I mentioned that A Vision by William Butler Yeats was the book that was one of the primary sources of inspiration for the New Vision. Um, which was an example of automatic writing. That was committing pen to paper and letting whatever came through just flow, just to write it all out without stopping, without trying to mold it into a particular narrative like Kerouac did. Although he was very spontaneous, and that's the thing that the Beats were known for. But in this pure example, in this book, A Vision by William Butler Yeats, of automatic writing, that may actually have influenced this phrase that the Beats became famous for, which was first thought, best thought. Many people point to Alan as the source of that. Alan always pointed back to Lucian as the source of that. Um, so the Beats never really did pure automatic writing because that wasn't really what they were here to do. There were some esoteric things that they believed in. Certainly, Burroughs was very interested in that whole universe. Um, but no one really did that. Maybe the closest things came was the bop prosody that Jack practiced. The cut up method was a form of randomization, which certainly was letting room, making room for the unknown to come through and to sometimes tell unexpected truths in that process of a kind of divination. Okay, the second thing, this idea of personal history. Lucian, his father abandoned him at a young age. Neil grew up kind of on Skid Row with his dad, living in various squats and different things. And then at a certain point, when Neil was relatively young, he lost touch with his dad. In fact, one of the subplots of the book On the Road is that they're searching for in vain for Neil's father. Um, but this idea that because of one's personal history, that you can either have more or less energy and awareness in the present moment was key to the insight that I was trying to share to shed light on the new vision and what it's actually about. And the third thing is this idea of not doing. This also has impact on the amount of energy that we can embody and hold in the present moment. This idea of the gratuitous act, as André Gide said, the acte gratuit. Um, this is a big part of Carlos Castaneda's universe, and it is so. To retrace my steps back to lecture one, Lucian Carr was very frustrated with the poets of his day using what he called the cute tricks to captivate an audience, to build a reputation and a career, to kind of play on people's minds and psychology, to create um, to create notoriety and ultimately income in that way. However, one key to art is to bring in something from the unseen, to do and express things that have never been seen before, or that are not readily explainable, in any, certainly not in some kind of capitalistic way. And so, as Carlos Castaneda, as a student of shamanism, certainly understood um, that that reaching for and interacting and collaborating with the unseen is very key to the new vision. Now enter Gregory. Oh, let's see. Okay, I already covered. Okay, all right. So Gregory had a very dicey, in fact, probably compared with the other two, maybe even more of a tragic childhood. So that brought him that advantage in these realms, or in the context of life as an artist. It brought him an advantage because he had an abundance of energy in the present moment, just like Lucian and Neil did. Partially because of the tragedy of his childhood, being abandoned by his mother. His father was there, but really he was bouncing around a lot to foster homes. He would see his father from time to time. His father went off to war. His father was abusive. It was not a good situation. He basically raised himself on the streets of New York. Um, all right, covered that. So these three ideas, the idea of the not doing, the idea of a certain allocation of energy based on one's relationship with their personal history, Gregory gave credence to these ideas um, in some of the statements that he made. Um, so I'm going to play a few clips. I want you to hear his voice, and these are actually from different times in his life. Um, so this idea of memories of the past having to do with an experience in the present. This is from an early draft of his poem Power. The meaning of this phrase stayed in it flipped around in the final printed version, the published version of it. But this was is interesting because of what he's saying about memory and being vivid in the present moment. So I want you to hear his voice. And if one would argue in the peanut gallery that, well, he's not corroborating your point because he changed the meaning in the published version of the poem. I would say simply to that, first thought, best thought. So let's hear what he has to say about memory. And hopefully this will come through clearly enough, but at least you'll hear his voice and I can rephrase it so you can catch the actual words.
Since I observe not memory but the images of the moment, I am here more vivid, more detailed, more distinct, and need not open the eye to close it.
I think that's pretty clear. I'm just going to gamble and say, well, I'll repeat it just for the hell of it. Since I observe not memory, but the images of the moment, I am here more vivid, more detailed, more distinct. I need not open the eye to close it. Secondly, what have we got here? Oh, I would highlight this too. If you go back to the poem Power and read the full text, it's very interesting because the sort of the gag or the hook of the poem is that he's using interchangeably the idea of personal power that Castaneda would understand and teach, and political power. So he's playing with those. He's very playful with those very those sort of contrasting ideas of what power is. Okay, this is interesting too because this is from an outtake from the incredible film that I got to see a couple of weeks ago, The Last Beat. It, for whatever reason, has not as of yet been distributed, but it pops up online. Apparently, there's people that don't want it to be distributed, and so it pops up and then it disappears. Well, sadly, since I saw it, is now disappeared from Vimeo. Um, but there's a wonderful, very short part that's literally it sort of comes in from something else. There's an edit. He makes the statement and it moves on. So it's very rough, but he makes a really interesting point that corroborates what I'm talking about with regard to. Well, I'll let it speak for itself, and then I'll come back to shed a little bit of light on it. Here goes. And this is a much older Gregory Corso.
Otherwise, the whole beat generation would not have happened. It would not have happened. Not through Burroughs and Carrick. They would not have had the energy to push it through. It was me and Alan and Peter that pushed that thing through with our silly actions and all that shit. not the dignified Burroughs, nor the personal hell Kerouac.
Okay, I'm gonna read that. I'm gonna read what he said again in case it wasn't clear. Otherwise, the whole Beat generation wouldn't have happened. It would not have happened. Burroughs and Kerouac, they would not have had the energy to push it through. It was me and Alan and Peter that pushed that thing through with our silly actions and all that shit. Not the dignified Burroughs nor the personal hell Kerouac. Again, they would not have had the energy. Were they tired? Were they sleepy? No. Their energy was devoted to other things. This would be an interesting exploration with Burroughs, the dignified Burroughs. And I think what he's trying to say here, Burroughs was trying to outrun his past and make a different name for himself that contrasted what he inherited from his parents and his grandparents with the Burroughs company. Um, that was probably a drain on his personal energy. Although certainly he was prolific as a writer, he did the things that he needed to do, but not in the way that Alan, Peter, and Gregory could have done it and did do it. Kerouac, and I mentioned this in the beginning as well, in the first lectures, Kerouac was preoccupied with the obligations to his father to take care of his mother. He had an unnatural, unhealthy relationship with his mother, and he was tormented by the conflict that he felt with his desire to live free and also to please God and the memory of his brother Gerard, who he lost when he was 4 years old. And so that became a drain on his energy. So, although he did it exquisitely and he certainly left his mark as a creator, absolutely amazing, but he had to struggle to describe the people who had this full embodiment that he couldn't quite do. So he did it perfectly in his own way through his words, but he didn't have the ability to push the as Gregory so well put it there, to push the Beat generation thing through. And the other thing that he talks about is through their silly actions. Again, going back to this idea of the gratuitous act, or as Castaneda would call it, the not doing. That was part of it because that has a lot to do with bringing energy into a room through your presence and through the things that you do. That when added to having that blank slate of personal history, because you're disconnected from it, because there's tragedy there, because it's not a reference point, because it's not something you feel obligated to. They Alan less so. Certainly Peter had that. Certainly Gregory had that. They had no obligation to their past, to their families, to their religion, or anything of the kind. And that's very important when we're talking about this kind of stuff. I already covered that. Already talked about that and that too. I love it. I love it when I ride past my little cue cards here. It's good because it's better coming from my head anyway. Okay, so and then I would say that one of the reasons that we needed the beats is because we have collective leaks of energy based on the collective consciousness and the obligations that we feel to family, to religion, to society, to keeping up with the Joneses. Again, this is why this cosmic intervention of the beat awareness was so important. Okay, I mentioned a little bit about Gregory's past history. If you want to go check out his Wikipedia article, it's very, very good and fascinating. Um, but he spent time in prison because he was basically, as I mentioned, raised on the streets and he was a thief. So he went to prison for a while. Um, but that ended up being a very formative experience because of what he learned there. There were mobsters around him in some of the cells there, and they gave him advice. There was a library there. He was able to read quite a bit, and that's where he started to dip his big toe, and eventually, well beyond that, in the classical knowledge. That not only did he learn in a bookish academic way, but he learned to inhabit with his imagination and his very presence in this life. One of the pieces of sage advice that he received in prison was that if you're ever given two options, take both. This is important because what we've been learning is that the new vision was a non-dual initiative, and that's where some of its magic came from. And in fact, that might be the overarching theme that allows us to embody and to be the art in a way that would otherwise be impossible. Because again, another drain on energy is trying to decide between two competing opposites. We spend a lot of our time as human beings on this earth doing exactly that, and so it causes us to. It's like we're stuttering. We don't know which direction to go, and so we proceed and we do the bare minimum to get through this life without ever fully embodying and living life fully and with enthusiasm in our chosen direction. And the classical awareness is critical. The reason being, a lot of that duality flows from the Judeo Christian traditions, which place one supreme God above all, and you're either on his good side or his bad side. Whereas with the classical awareness, we had this whole pantheon of is like a buffet of gods that we can see ourselves reflected in. It's very similar to like the zodiac. You have these profiles of people, and we find elements of our own personality, and it becomes a subject of contemplation. It's much more diverse, it's much more open ended, and it's less about rules and it's more about archetypes. And that's a very healthy thing to contemplate. Whereas if you're riddled with guilt and trying to please this or that God that we believe is supreme because we were taught to believe that everything else sucked except for our chosen God or the one that we grew up worshiping, it creates a very different kind of life experience, one that's very, very hobbled. Um, so, with this awareness, Gregory was able to become much more than the average person. If we look at the work, for example, of Joseph Campbell was really well versed and well steeped in this whole idea of not just say like Greek myths versus the Roman myths, but literally the global um, scene of mythology, story, and things like that. And so it becomes not a mutually exclusive one supreme God situation, but mutually inclusive because he and his research and teaching understood how everything actually agreed overall. And we have in this country we have this phrase "e pluribus unum," or "out of many one," and that is certainly the awareness that Joseph Campbell shared, and also um, that Gregory was able to embody. So that in itself is very non-dual because we're not creating a division that says this is the good side and this is the bad side. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit more going forward about this non-dual reality. One of the books, I'm going to take a little side trip here. One of the books that Gregory was that I don't know if he was given. It was I don't know how they did it. If he got to go to the library, he asked the guard for a book or whatever, however that went down. But one of the books that he read was an 11-volume set actually called The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. Um, and that actually have book one right here, which is called Our Oriental Heritage. Book two is here as well. It is called The Life of Greece. And I want to read something in the first 4 pages that I found to be really amazing, having to do with the definition of civilization and what impact this may have had. I can only speculate. May have had um, on Gregory's life. So, chapter 1, the conditions of civilization. Civilization is a social order promoting cultural creation. Four elements constitute it: economic provision, political organization, moral traditions, and the pursuit of knowledge and the arts. It begins where chaos and insecurity end. For when fear is overcome, curiosity and constructiveness are free, and man passes by natural impulse towards the understanding and embellishment of life. So imagine being Gregory. You're in prison for being a thief. In other words, the fact that you're in prison represents a pre civilized behavior, right? And yet he has the free time in that space to learn and to learn deeply. I mentioned that Gregory embodied certain things because of his extraordinary energy. He could be the scholar, he could be the teacher, he could be the poet, things that Lucian and Neil weren't able to do. But in order to achieve that, he took on the classical primordial role of the poet, which meant he lived with an understanding of his role as one of privilege, that he didn't have to obey the rules of society. So, in that sense, whereas other people were tying on a necktie, certainly Neil tried to do that. Definitely Lucian did that. He Lucian found his freedom, um, his civilization through the time saving of having a job and a career, if that makes sense. In other words, he bought his leisure through the sweat of his brow, you could say, whereas Gregory had access to leisure by being willing to live at the bottom. Much of that time, not a certain amount of that time was spent in Europe, where they had a better understanding of the classical primordial role of the poet, and they let him get away with a lot. But Gregory had to do all kinds of things. He begged, he borrowed, he stole. There's a story that said he'd meet a woman he was interested in. The first thing he'd do is ask how much money she had on earth and ask for half of it. I'm sure he didn't always get it, but he said elsewhere uh, later in that clip that I didn't play, where he basically says he owes his life and career to women and Jews who are willing to sponsor him and put up with him. Um, let's see. So the simple basic idea of human society reaches civilization when um, people understand that their needs are met. People understand Gregory to be an almost feral person. He was a troublemaker by many accounts. He was a junkie. Um, and like I said, uh, the phrase that Oscar Wilde coined, that how is that? It's in one of these cards here. Where did it go? Oh, it's in here somewhere. I'll paraphrase it. Oscar Wilde said, all of us are lying in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And that has been aptly applied to Gregory. So he was somewhat uncivilized, but he used his knowledge and his recognition that he was in an epic play, playing a particular role to thrive nonetheless. Here we are. We are all in the gutter. Some of us are looking at the stars. Oscar Wilde. So, how does this definition of civilization relate to the beats uh, and to the new vision? Because as we understand understand what their role was, it the Beats and Gregory, they had their cake and they ate it too. That was the first example, or at least one of the key examples of non-duality. They said, "Give me both." Doesn't mean they got rich, but it means that they claimed their leisure to bring about something more, sometimes through their own sacrifice. Allen Ginsberg certainly sacrificed a lot of his sustenance in order to help other people to be able to reach their civilization. Those that couldn't necessarily function, including Gregory, couldn't function very well in a capitalistic society. And he applied the Gregory in particular applied the advice um, to choose both when being offered two options. In this case, career versus being a poet, regular career versus being a poet. And he never really left survival mode. But because his imagination and self awareness were so well anchored in the infinite, he was able to proceed and live an extraordinary life nonetheless. Now, Lucian, I talked a little bit about Lucian, mentioned him briefly there, that he did put that tie on and he went to work. But that's not a failure of the new vision either, because when we have that level of embodiment, we know that wherever we are, that presence is. And we can do whatever we need to do, whatever we want to do. And we are taking our art with us, and we are that art. And I'm going to do another lecture. If it's either going to be the next one or the one after that, but it will be uh, financial expediency in the new vision. That'll be a fun one. So examples of the non-dual nature of the new vision and the work of the Beats, which is encompassed and epitomized in the new vision, although it hasn't really been described until now that I've seen. Mortal and divine. That's uniquely classical. Culture versus counterculture, which I covered in a previous lecture. East versus West, bringing those two together. Meaning versus meaninglessness, which was lecture 4 specifically. Mentioned Joseph Campbell already. So they provided a vantage point beyond duality, beyond division. Now, I mentioned Gregory's classical understanding, the fact that he taught at some length for years and years at Naropa on these very subjects. But he wasn't alone. I mentioned, in addition to being an example of automatic writing, the book A Vision by William Butler Yeats that Lucian had under his arm when he was being arraigned in court for the murder of David Cameron, was a cosmology. It was an alternative cosmology in the classical vein. It was relatively modern, came from I believe, the late 19th century, but nonetheless, it certainly fits into the classical mold. There's that. Neil Cassidy was a devotee and follower of Edgar Cayce, who in classical terms would have been referred to as an oracle. So they all had this interest. They were all looking beyond ordinary timelines and beyond established religions and traditions to find their answers, and they were delving into those things deeply. Neil, Lucian, and Gregory. Moving right along. I've been thinking about this thing for so many months. It's like my brain is rolling. This. Fortunately, all the stuff's getting out without the cards. But in the meantime, I have to sort out which cards I've passed and which ones I haven't. All right. So Gregory personally had his non-dual thrust. He was an agent of change, and he knew it. Many people knew him to be a tough guy to be around. Uh-oh. Are we still going? Okay, good. I got a low battery. So I'm gonna have to make this quick. Okay, continuing and finishing. Um, so Gregory, in his own life and his own behavior, brought together opposites as well as the Beats did. Some of those are in this classical orientation: God and man, or the divine and man. I should say the gods, right? The idea of being feral and erudite at the same time. And in actuality, as this kind of agent, he put himself bodily in the way. Like, in other words, he tossed himself into the fray to make sure, in every way that he could, in his presence and the things that he verbalized, he was preventing settling into solidity, complacency, and the assumption of correctness when it wasn't appropriate. And most people experience this as a kind of, uh, he had a contrarian personality. People that loved him also at the same time had a really hard time being around him, because it didn't matter what was going on. He was always there to challenge and oppose. In that sense, it's almost, well, let's use some examples. Um, I don't know how many times, just in the recorded record, because I wasn't there. Uh, you know, Alan would be giving a reading. Either he was on the stage with Alan or he was in the audience. And he would heckle him, and he'd say, "Alan, knock off the posy bullshit." He didn't like. He was there to oppose everything, like literally. And so a lot of people, I think, tolerated it because they're like, well, poet's privilege. He's a fun guy. He's a crazy guy. This guy is part of history. I want to be around him. Like, the fame thing, right? But I don't think a lot of people really understood what he was doing. He was personally standing in the way. He was throwing his body into the gears of complacency. And in that role, he really bridged the reality of friend versus enemy. He was kind of like the original frenemy, as the kids are saying today. But because he had that special mythological embodiment, it's almost like he was like a force of nature, but you could almost say he was like a human nature spirit in that sense. I came across this poem the other day, and it immediately made me think of him, and I'm going to end with it. This is from Andrew Marvell. I've heard it said both ways, Marvel and Marvell. And this is from the poem the picture of little TC in a prospect of flowers. See with what simplicity this nymph begins her golden days. In the green grass she loves to lie, and there with her fair aspect tames the wilder flowers, and gives them names. But only with the roses plays, and then does tell what color best becomes them, and what smell. Who can foretell for what high cause this darling of the gods was born? Yet this is she whose chaster laws the wanton love shall one day fear, and under her commands severe see his bow broken and ensigns torn. Happy who can appease this virtuous enemy of man. And I thought, virtuous enemy, that's a perfect description of Gregory Corso. So that's it. I got through it. And hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for being here. And I will see you next time when we're going to discuss Lucian as an example of financial expediency in the context of the new vision. Talk to you later.